Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Cove by L.J. Ross, narrated by Clare Corbett.
Prologue. Natural History Museum, London. How much longer do we need to keep standing here, grinning like idiots? Gabrielle Adams turned to her friend and colleague, whose long, slender body languished against the wall beside her. "Another hour at least," she said. "There's bound to be more speeches, and there will definitely be more hands to shake." The Frenchman Saunders Christmas party was always a lengthy affair, although the evening had started out well enough, as far as corporate publishing events ever could. As their chosen venue, London's Natural History Museum was resplendent. Subtle lighting highlighted its Romanesque arches and intricate tilework, while industrial spotlights shone their bright mortuary white glow upon the skeleton of an enormous blue whale suspended overhead, as well as a mastodon and numerous other dinosaur fossils scattered around the central atrium. The great and the good of the publishing world had gathered to enjoy the bottomless hospitality of one of the United Kingdom's oldest and most revered publishing houses, each jockeying for position to capture the attention of commissioning editors, agents and press hounds, who moved amongst them like sharks, circling a particularly juicy-looking shoal of unsuspecting fish. Alcohol flowed freely, while canapes flowed rather less so, but few seemed to notice the disparity. A large projector screen had been erected at the top of an impressive stone staircase, upon which an endless slideshow played, showcasing the company's achievements that year, and, in particular, the images of those authors currently in favour with the powers that be. "At least we're allowed to drink red wine this year," Gabrielle continued. "Last year, the venue told us we weren't allowed to drink anything more pigmented than a gin and tonic, for fear any spillages would damage the marble." Francesca Ogilvy, better known as Frenchie, for reasons better left unsaid, let out a muffled groan. "Give me a karaoke bar any day of the week. At least we could let our hair down properly over a few shots and a bad rendition of Sweet Caroline. As it is, we've got to spend the next however long listening to a bunch of insecure writers, telling them how bloody great they are," she grumbled. "Oh, God, here comes one of them now." Gabrielle followed her line of sight and saw a man of around 60 weaving his way through the crowd. Of average height and build, he was unremarkable in every respect, but had made up for it with a liberal choice of attire and, unless she was much mistaken, an even more liberal application of Just for Men, which had the desired effect of making its wearer more memorable, albeit for the wrong reasons. She watched him linger on the outskirts of smaller groups of people who had gathered to talk and sip cocktails, whereupon he made several cack-handed attempts to join their conversation. There were some polite nods, but for the most part, he was roundly ignored. "When was Jeff's last bestseller?" Frenchie wondered aloud. 6, maybe 7 years ago? In the mind of the reading public, Geoffrey Bowman was a well-regarded author of spy thrillers, whose books had reached many millions of people over the course of his 30-year career. However, within the rarefied world of publishing, being a household name and recipient of numerous tin cup trophies for one's writing prowess was not always enough to guarantee the next big advance. In short, the books still had to sell, and if they didn't, it was a slippery slope into the worst kind of hell for a man like Jeff Bowman. Total obscurity. Gabrielle watched him make small talk and heard him emit his trademark guffaw, which had once been described by a broadsheet critic as a laugh as large as the man's literary talent. Now, sadly, it bore a tinge of desperation and was not shared by the younger members of the group over which he was attempting to hold court. "It's a fickle business," she murmured. "He's still a good writer. He's just not—" "Relevant?" Frenchie put in, with a twist of her lips. Gabrielle sighed. "To a certain audience, he will always be relevant." Frenchie snorted. "The man's more of a fossil than that dinosaur bone," she said, gesturing towards one of the displays. "I'm surprised you keep him on your books, when you could have the pick of the bunch." If Gabrielle detected a touch of envy, she chose to ignore it. Fundamentally, he can write a good book, she said. I don't have to like the man to publish his stories. Mayday, Mayday, Frenchie interrupted, and knocked back the rest of her drink. He spotted us and is making a beeline. Look, as much as I love you, I don't think I can face listening to Jeff pontificating about the good old days for the next half hour. You're on your own. Gabrielle's expression was pained. Don't you dare! Frenchie gave her friend a dazzling white smile, one she knew would absolve her of all sins, and melted into the crowd mere moments before they were set upon.
Ah, Gabrielle, just the woman I was looking for.
She turned, her smile already fixed firmly in place, and found herself reciprocating the continental double air kiss she'd always detested. Jeff, she said, once the ministrations were over. Are you enjoying the party? He took a healthy swig of white wine and looked around the room with eyes that were both jaded and hard.
Same every year, isn't it?
He said, clearly unmoved by the impressive architecture of their surroundings. A large Christmas tree stood laden with lights and baubles on the far side of the room, whilst cheesy holiday classics played from hidden speakers, reminding them all to be merry and bright. Tables of drinks manned by white-gloved waiters have been set up, alongside various other gimmicks, such as the selfie space where authors could have their picture taken with the official Frenchman Saunders publishing backdrop, or the cocktail bar, which served drinks with names taken from the company's most recent list of best-selling titles. Sadly, none of Jeff's titles had made the cut, so he'd opted for wine instead. How's the manuscript coming along? Gabrielle asked him, and immediately wished she hadn't.
Oh, slowly. Slowly. You know how these things are. You can't rush genius,
he said, without any irony whatsoever.
I don't understand this new wave coming up the ranks, you know. They seem to bash out a novel every other week, and lo and behold, the week after, it's a bloody bestseller.
With a cocktail named after it, he added silently. Well, the thing is, Jeff, some writers can be very prolific, which is a good thing for the readers who enjoy their stories, she said fairly. It means they don't have to wait so long for the next book to come out. He snorted.
People should be more discerning,
he said, and took another chug of wine. And you should get off your high horse, Gabrielle was tempted to say, but held her tongue.
While we're on the subject, I wanted to bend your ear,
Jeff said, and moved closer, effectively boxing her in against the wall.
It's about my last advance.
Gabrielle's face became shuttered. I hardly think this is the time to discuss it, she said, casting a meaningful eye around the room. Why not give me a call on Monday? But Jeff ploughed on.
I'm an international bestseller,
he said expansively, getting into his stride.
I've won more awards than almost anybody else in this room, and yet, here I am, slaving away for a pittance. Now you tell me, is that right? Is it fair?
She tried to take a sip from her glass, only to find it empty. Look, Jeff, we've already had this discussion. The advance I offered you, and which you accepted, was based on the most recent performance figures we have to hand. There isn't any easy way to say this, but as you and I both know, the books aren't selling as well as we'd hoped. He turned a slow shade of puce.
That can only be because the blasted covers are nothing to look at,
he boomed, drawing a few interested glances from those within earshot.
As for the most recent advertising campaign, well, that was a shambles.
Gabrielle remained silent, choosing not to engage in what had become an age-old debate. When a book didn't sell, there might be many reasons, but the first and most important in her eyes was the quality of the story. As his editor, she tried to make the man's most recent efforts the best they could be, but she couldn't work miracles. Maybe you should take a break, she suggested. Have some time to regroup and come back to the manuscript with fresh eyes. Bowman favoured her with a fulminating glare, then leaned in to rest an unsteady hand on the wall beside her head.
Maybe I should just move to another publisher. What do you say to that?
Gabrielle stepped deftly out of the way so that he was left to face an empty wall. You must always do what you feel is best, she said simply. Enjoy the rest of the party. He watched her move off into the crowd, heard the tinkling laughter of women in pink pashminas and men in twill chinos rise up in a cacophony, and felt bile rise to his throat. It was a far cry from the early days, when the air had been filled with cigarette smoke, and it had been men like himself who ran the show, not young women, barely older than the daughter he hadn't seen for 3 years now. He'd been somebody to reckon with then. Crowds had parted for him. Glasses had been raised for him, and every one of the snotty-nosed little chits who now snubbed him would have been clamouring just to spend a sweaty 10 minutes in the broom cupboard on the off chance he'd put in a good word for them with his agent. Now, he had to snivel and beg for what was rightfully his. He'd earned his place amongst these people, damn it. He deserved to have his books displayed on the bookcase in the main foyer of Frenchman Saunders, not some little nobody who claimed to be the next big thing. Perhaps it was time to remind Gabrielle and her little cohort of who really pulled the strings. Gabrielle moved away swiftly, exchanging forced pleasantries as she made her way through the throng towards the ladies' room. It might not be much of a reprieve, but at least there would be a measure of peace and quiet in the relative safety of a toilet cubicle. Her eyes scanned the faces of those she passed, searching for one in particular, but found no sign of him. She let out a small sigh. Mark Talbot was a rising star in the world of literary agents, which had been helped in no small part by the fact his grandfather, Marcus Talbot Sr., had founded one of the most prestigious literary agencies in London over 70 years ago. That company was Talbot & Co., and as well as bearing its name, Mark bore a considerable weight of expectation. Many of the authors he represented were at the party that evening, and it was part of his job to pitch new books to her for publication, something which called into question her personal integrity on a regular basis, given that he also happened to be her fiance. Unconsciously, her fingers twisted the sparkling diamond ring which adorned the third finger of her left hand.
Come here often?
As she stepped into the shadows of the corridor leading to the toilets, a pair of strong arms wrapped around her. She let out a strangled cry before realising they belonged to the very person she'd been looking for. "Mark," she said, "you scared me."
"Sorry, gorgeous,"
he said, and spun her around to reveal a boyishly handsome face and a pair of over-bright eyes. "Where have you been?" she asked. "I was looking for you."
"Oh, just doing the rounds,"
he said breezily.
"Why? Did you miss me?"
He began to edge her back against the wall, nuzzling her neck. "Mark, stop it! Mark! Somebody might see."
"So what? That's what Christmas parties are all about."
She gave a nervous laugh and pressed a firm palm against his chest. "Mark, this is my work. I have to be professional." He ran a frustrated hand through his hair, which tended to flop over his forehead, before holding both hands up in surrender.
"I forgot," he said, with an edge to his voice. "Work comes first these days, doesn't it?"
Gabrielle frowned.
"That's not fair. You don't have to go into it," he said brusquely. "If you want to stick to shop talk, I need to speak to you about Saffron, as a matter of fact."
Saffron Wallows was Mark's most prestigious client. She wrote high-concept literature, featuring tortured, downtrodden female characters who tended to meet an unsavoury end more often than not. Though the general line in their business was that writing about violence against females was not de rigueur, hers invariably managed to slip through the net on account of the higher, more important messages she intended to convey. Or so said the party line.
"I'd have thought you'd be a lot more excited about the opportunity I'm giving you," Mark said when she didn't respond. "I could go to any of the big five, and they bite my hand off to publish her next masterpiece."
He referred to the coven of publishing giants, every one of them a competitor. "You know the reason I'm not interested," she reminded him. He stepped away and stuck his hands in his pockets, surveying her with barely concealed impatience.
"Not that rubbish again."
She folded her arms across her chest, thinking of their most recent argument. "I've already told you, Mark. I'll pass."
"Have you spoken to your boss about it? How do you think Jacinta will feel when she hears about your decision? Frenchman Saunders has published Saffron's work since the 90s.
Gabrielle had indeed thought about it. Trying to come up with a way out of their predicament had cost her many a sleepless night. "Please, Mark, I'm trying to help you, to help us both. Don't force my hand." He stared at her for long seconds, his face no longer the playful mask it had once been.
"Is that a threat?"
he said, very softly. Gabby ran a tired hand over her eyes, then shook her head. "Of course it isn't. But I think you should reconsider what I told you the other night, that's all. It's bound to come out sooner or later, and I'd rather not have to be the one to blow the whistle." They faced one another in the shadows of the empty corridor, while George Michael sang balefully about giving someone his heart last Christmas.
"How much longer are you going to stay?"
Mark asked. "At the party?" He nodded. "I was planning to get the last tube home from South Ken," she replied, and automatically checked her watch. 11:35. The last train from South Kensington Station was at around 1:45, she knew, and was only a 5-minute walk from the museum. That left plenty of time to make the obligatory farewells and administer as many air kisses as required.
"I'll see you at home then,"
Mark said, and left without a backward glance. Gabrielle saw nothing of Mark after that, and since there was no sign of Frenchie either, she decided to call it a night. The alcohol had lost its taste, and what had once seemed festive and glossy now appeared garish and overdone. The crowd was starting to dwindle, and although it might have been expected of her to remain until all her company's guests had departed, fatigue had overtaken any finer sensibilities, and she was eager to get home, but not before the obligatory farewells. In the end, it took another 40 minutes to work her way around the room, thanking this person and that, promising to call others on Monday to arrange lunch, and by the end of it all, her head was throbbing and her feet aching in the heels she'd worn for style rather than comfort. When she stepped out of the main entrance to the museum and into the brisk December air, it felt like a balm to her overheated skin, and she stood for a minute or two, breathing it in. Then, gathering her coat around her, she made her way along Exhibition Road towards the station, her mind lost in thought. What kind of mood would Mark be in when she got home? The flat they shared was in the Fulham area, which was only a couple of stops away from South Kensington, on the District line. As a Londoner, born and bred, Gabrielle harboured none of the fears that might have plagued the tourists who passed through London's city streets, although she kept an alarm on her at all times and remained vigilant when walking alone. She still used public transport because, in all her 28 years, she hadn't experienced anything worse than having a mobile phone stolen. All the same, when she caught sight of the headline plastered across the front page of one of the free daily newspapers left in a stack outside the station entrance, it gave her pause. "Tube killer strikes again." Gabrielle hesitated, thinking of the recent reports of 2 women having been pushed onto the train tracks by an unknown assailant who remained at large. She checked the time. 12:40. In another 5 minutes, the last train would have come and gone. She looked around her, at the street with its closed shop windows and barred metal shutters, and felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Fear. Every shadow might have been a person. Every noise might have been the quiet tread of somebody following her home. She shivered and quickly brought up an app on her smartphone which allowed her to search for taxis in the vicinity, only to find that the nearest was 12 minutes away. Having already lost a precious 2 minutes finding that out, she decided to stop jumping at shadows and fumbled around her bag for her tube pass. Her fingers brushed against the jingling metal of her keychain, and, grasping them in one hand and the pass in the other, she made her way hurriedly through the turnstiles and into the station. Her feet clattered against the metal treads of the long escalator, leading down to the platform level, its mechanism whining and clanking as it moved in a continuous loop. She saw nothing but her own reflection, little more than a flash of moving colour against the dull, silver-panelled walls, heard nothing but her own blood thundering in her ears while her legs pumped as fast as they could. "Mind the gap." Gabrielle heard the loud automated message signalling that the doors of a train were about to close, and left the escalator at a run, prepared to make a final dash. Only to find that the train, sitting there like a quiet sentinel, was ready to depart from the opposite platform. She slowed to a walk, her breath condensing on the air in small clouds while her heart rate returned to normal, her fingers relaxing on the keys she still clutched in her hand. Peering through the windows of the train, she found it surprisingly empty, its occupants consisting mostly of security guards returning home from long shifts, or single travellers slumped against perspex dividers, their eyes already drooping shut. Given the time of year, she'd expected to find the platform teeming with people, but instead there was only herself and one or two others scattered at intervals. Tube killer strikes again. An image of the headline flashed into her mind, and she wondered again whether it had been wise to travel alone. Mark hadn't offered to take her home. Sudden tears filled her eyes, followed by immediate anger at her own weakness. She didn't need a man to take her home, did she? Perhaps, had they not been rowing so much lately, he might have come back with her as he always used to. But she was a grown woman and could take care of herself. She repeated the words inside her head like a mantra. The truth was, she'd blown everything out of proportion, and there was nothing to be frightened of, not really. Sure, it made for a sensational headline, but there were 11 tube lines in London, stretching over something in the region of 250 miles, according to the game of Trivial Pursuit she'd been forced to play as a kind of team-building exercise in the conference room back at Frenchman Saunders' head office. That was a lot of ground for one lone madman to cover, and the chance of their being in the same place at the same time was very low indeed. Buoyed by her own logic, Gabrielle took a few deep breaths and watched the train move away from the opposite platform, her eyes locking with those of a woman of around her own age, before the carriage picked up speed and disappeared into the night. The concourse was quiet in the wake of its departure, and she watched the electronic board for any update on the whereabouts of her own train, which was now running late. The train to Wimbledon is delayed by 3 minutes. 3 minutes. That was nothing in the scheme of things, was it? And yet the night air whipped around her, crawling through the layers of her clothing to trail across her skin like icy tentacles. The platform was eerily silent. Lone figures standing too far away for her to make out distinguishing features, such that they all melted into the same face in her mind. The face of an unknown man who was prepared to kill. Shivering badly now, she scuttled back against the wall, keeping beneath the bold yellow strip lights and near to the escalators, far back from the platform edge. 2 minutes. Her eyes darted left, right, then over her shoulder. Nobody. She found herself thinking of what Jeff Bowman might have made of her situation, and a bubble of laughter escaped her lips. She could see herself through his eyes, pale and frightened, huddled against the backdrop of an old poster advertising homeopathic remedies for stress, and made a mental note to suggest it to him as a potential plotline, perhaps for a farce. 1 minute. She rubbed her arms and swayed from one foot to the other, counting down the seconds in her head. Suddenly, there came a rush of cold air, and the distant rumble of an oncoming train, again from the opposite platform at her back. Turning, she watched the last northbound train shriek into the station, and to her relief, this time it was full of passengers. A moment later, they spilled out of its doors, groups of chattering men and women filling the empty space with sound and colour, and their presence made a mockery of her previous fears. With the comforting stream of people at her back, Gabrielle turned away to stare into the gaping darkness of the tunnel on her own platform, knowing that any moment now the train would arrive. Her eyes traced the tattered posters on the walls, touting everything from upcoming concerts to Saffron Wallow's latest book, for which she'd been awarded the Women's Prize for Fiction. Did she have to see that woman's name everywhere? Yes, Gabrielle thought dully, and she had only herself to blame for that. Lost in thought, the roar of carriages echoing through the blackened tunnel startled her, and she watched as twin yellow headlights appeared through the gloom like cat's eyes, sending rats and mice scurrying for cover from the great metal beast. With only seconds to go, she moved closer to the platform edge, feet shuffling forward on autopilot, while the rush of cold, dirty air that preceded the train whipped her hair around her head. A second was all it took for her life to change. Even as her hand lifted to brush the hair from her eyes, Gabrielle felt the air leave her body. Her heart gave a single lurch, slamming against the wall of her chest as one strong hand planted itself in the small of her back and pushed. Hard. Suddenly, she was falling, weightless for an endless moment before the ground rushed up to meet her. A deafening scream of brakes drowning out the sickening crunch of bone and flesh as her body crumpled onto the tracks. Chapter 1. 6 months later. Gabrielle awoke with a scream. Arms flailing, legs kicking, she sent a half-empty can of Diet Coke flying across the aisle of the passenger train, where it fizzed over the sandalled feet of her nearest neighbour. One elbow connected with the window, but she felt no pain. Her mind was still far away in another place, at another time.
"Hey, watch it!"
Slowly, the veil lifted, and she became aware of her surroundings and the chaos she had caused.
"Oh, I'm so sorry."
Mortified, face flushed with shame, she fell onto her hands and knees to make a grab for the can, which rolled back and forth beneath the adjoining chairs, its contents seeping into the carpet tile. Feeling the heat of all eyes upon her, Gabrielle snatched it up and beat a hasty retreat towards the relative privacy of the vestibule area, before she could succumb to tears and embarrass herself any further. She stumbled along the aisle as the train lurched back and forth, her body shaking in the aftermath of yet another daytime terror. The doctors had told her that nightmares would be a perfectly normal response to the trauma she'd suffered, but had assured her they'd grow less frequent with time, and, naively, she believed them. Unfortunately, after 6 months, vivid memories of the past still invaded her sleep, whether during the night or day, and intruded into her waking thoughts without any obvious trigger, leaving her perpetually sleep-deprived and anxious, the victim of constantly heightened levels of cortisol and adrenaline. As Mark had once told her, she was a paranoid mess. Her mind wandered back to that painful exchange, a month or so after she'd returned home from the hospital. "Why couldn't the police get in touch with you that night?" she'd asked him, for the millionth time.
"For God's sake, Gabby, give it a rest. I've already told you my phone battery died, and I went for a walk after the party ended. I needed to clear my head." But what, Gabby? What are you saying? That I'm having an affair? Is that what you're saying now?"
No. He looked at her with something like pity.
"I know you've been through something terrible, but you need to get a grip on yourself and move on. Wash your hair. Make a bit of an effort, like you used to. You're turning into a paranoid mess."
Even knowing what she now knew, which was, of course, that Mark had been having an affair for months, did little to lessen the sting of his words. Like poisoned darts, they'd wormed their way into her heart and made a home there. Her fingers strayed to her left hand, tracing the thin, pale line where a ring had once been. "I have to beat this," she thought. "I have to beat this, or I'll lose my mind." When the doctors had first mentioned the term post-traumatic stress disorder, she thought of army veterans who'd been through much greater degrees of trauma than herself. But, as she soon realised, mental health disorders didn't discriminate, and they didn't restrict themselves to certain categories of victim. There was no hierarchy, only an understanding shared by anyone who'd ever had the misfortune to suffer from PTSD. Insomnia, guilt, nausea, flashbacks, irritability, they were her constant bedfellows, not to mention the added bonus of selective amnesia to top it off. It had taken all her courage and the help of a strong beta-blocker to manage the bustling concourse at Paddington, the noise of which had caused her to break out in a sweat and run for the nearest loo, while her body forcibly rejected the memories that rushed forth in a tidal wave. It had taken yet more strength to board the train, dragging 2 enormous suitcases behind her, and the only reason she'd forced herself to do it was on account of being unable to drive whilst taking antidepressants. She'd been faced with Hobson's choice: stop taking the medication prescribed by her psychiatrist in order to drive to Cornwall, which was not an option, or face her greatest fear and board a train instead. Cornwall. The enormity of the decision she'd made was enough to elicit a fresh film of sweat. What had she done?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?